Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome everyone to Network 2020's discussion. Today we will be talking about Putin's perpetual power in an election where the results were known, but the implications are ones that I think are worth revisiting in today's geopolitical climate. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I am the president of Network 2020. And it is a pleasure to have two wonderful guests with us today. Before we begin, I'll just say a few words about Network 2020 for those who are joining us, perhaps for the first time. We're a New York-based nonprofit, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. So we do a lot of discussions like these ones that we hold online, as well as in-person events in New York. And we're really just trying to dig a few levels deeper into what you might be hearing about in the news or sometimes not hearing about in the news, because we believe an informed understanding is very important for everyone in today's world. So with that, it is a great pleasure to welcome our two wonderful guests. They both have the distinct honor of having been sanctioned by the Kremlin because their scholarship has hit a bit too close to home for Putin's comfort. So I am pleased to welcome back to Network 2020 Professor Kim Marten. She is a professor of political science at Barnard College and a faculty member of Columbia's Harriman Institute for Russian and East Central European Studies and the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. So she specializes in international relations and international security with an interest in Russia. So welcome back, Kim. And we are also pleased to welcome Professor Katherine Stoner. She is the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and the Senior Fellow at the Center on International Security and Cooperation at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford, where she had served as the Deputy Director previously. So with that, welcome, Katherine. Welcome back, Kim. I think we can have a very interesting conversation today. And I look forward to the question. So, Kim, starting with you. Putin's re-election in the Russian presidential election was a foregone conclusion after 24 years of power. I remember studying in Russia back when I think he had first come to power, and that was a long time ago. How has he or his governing style changed over this period of time? And why go through the election process again, given the very obvious results?
So thank you for having me on today, Courtney, and it's good to see Katherine, and thank you all in the audience for joining us. There's just no question that Putin's governing style has become increasingly authoritarian with time. We have watched this happening gradually and then not so gradually. So we know that no dissent is tolerated in Russia and that the election was completely rigged. What was kind of interesting is that there were these three alternative candidates who were running in the election. And we just learned from Meduza the other day, an online source that provides very interesting Russian news, that because they just magically made more than 3% of the vote for each of them, their political parties are going to get a hefty payout from the Russian government for having them be running. And so that's why those people ran against Putin. But as far as what purposes the election serve, I think there's three. The first one is it is, a veneer of legitimacy. It allows Putin to continue to tell everybody that he won the elections and that he's the legitimate president. I think more importantly, because so many people were forced to vote by having their phones be watched, by having their companies, if they work for the state in any way, which many people do work for the state, watching to see whether they voted and how they voted. It's also a way of making ordinary people complicit in the Russian system. And this is another technique that Putin has used, just like the old KGB used to use in Stalinist times. If you turn everybody into an informer, then everybody's complicit in the system. If you make everybody vote and actually make a positive mark on that ballot, then you have turned them complicit because they have essentially given their implicit agreement that they are participating in the system. But I think a third thing that political scientists are very interested in, but that the regular population and the press might not think about a lot, is that elections are a way of giving information to the leaders that they wouldn't already have. And I think that there was one very important piece of information. I know Katherine's going to talk about the opposition, but one very important piece of information that Putin got from these elections And that was because of the earlier running of a potentially serious contender. His name was Boris Nadezhdin, who was forced to drop out before he had a chance to actually put his name on the ballot, but who ended up getting over 100,000 signatures because tens of thousands of people lined up at all these regional offices to say yes, they wanted his name on the ballot. And the reason that that was so significant, he's kind of a nobody. He's run for political elections for a long, long time and never really been a very serious political actor. And there was some speculation that Putin originally urged him to run and that he'd get something for it. But the reason this was so significant is that he ran on an explicitly anti-war platform. From the beginning, he said he was against the war. He thought the war was stupid. It wouldn't accomplish anything. And during the time that he was a campaigner, he met with the wives of the Russian men who are currently serving in Ukraine. And so even though he wasn't on the ballot, the information that Putin got from that is that there's a very hefty amount of anti-war sentiment in Russian society. And in particular, that means that probably Putin doesn't want to do another round of mobilization to go fight in Ukraine. Because if he were to mobilize even more and more men to go fight in Ukraine, that is going to significantly undercut his popularity, which has sort of, follow-on effects for how the elites think about him and his notion as being the correct person to stay in power. So I'll stop there and let Katherine take the rest.
Okay, thank you. That's great. And I hope we can get to the Ukraine piece later, because I think that that's a really interesting point about the anti-war sentiment. Katherine, turning to you, I wanted to talk about the news that happened right before the election, which was the death of Alexei Navalny, the leader of the political opposition in Russia. What is the status today of the political opposition in Russia, and how does Navalny's death impact their movement?
So I should say he was one of the leaders of the of a very disparate opposition, and another one had been assassinated in 2015, Boris Nemtsov. So I think we see, first of all, in terms of support, building a little bit on Kim's excellent comments. There's not going to be a heavy debate between the two of us. I think we're probably in emphatic agreement, but sort of building on that, not only did Nadezhdin's drive to get signatures to get on the ballot, and of course the regime did what it always does, is find a reason to dismiss those signatures as illegitimate. Beyond that, the turnout really mattered, right? So that's why there was so much mobilization. This is the first time they've ever had a presidential election over 3 days instead of just in 1 day. This is the first time there's been an electronic voting option for maybe about a third of eligible voters. Apparently turnout there was something like 99% with the electronic voting system. There were mobile voting boxes. So if you couldn't make it to the polls could come to you. And it's kind of difficult to dismiss somebody who comes to your door with the ballot to say you're too busy to vote, right? So turnout really mattered because he wanted an emphatic mandate for the next 6 years. And of course, he could be president for 6 years beyond that. So what about the opposition? As you mentioned, Alexei Navalny died. He was killed by the state, one way or another, either immediately, that is through direct means by a poisoning or a hit over the head or something, in this terrible Arctic, this prison up in the Arctic Circle. He had been in the prison system since his return in 2021. And he had previously been poisoned and was in Germany for 4 months before that. So there's a lot of speculation about what happened. We don't know clearly yet. I'm sitting here at Stanford University. His wife was out here, and his daughter is currently still a student here. But their movements or argument is that he was there were conversations that had progressed to have him exchanged for a Russian prisoner who's being held in Germany for assassinating a Chechen opposition leader. Putin mysteriously, after the elections, for one of the first times, said Mr. Navalny's name in public. He has had a practice over the last 12 years since Alexei Navalny really rose to prominence in the opposition of referring to him as that man or that person or and he said it was quote unquote unfortunate, but these things happen. And yes, he was interested. He had been interested in this prisoner exchange. So the speculation of Navalny's team is that in fact he wanted to take Navalny out as an option for prisoner exchange, and it might have been some combination of Evan Gershkovich from the Wall Street Journal, Navalny, and Paul Whelan, who is a U.S. citizen who's been in jail for about 6 or 7 years now there. So what does that do? And what does this election say about the opposition? I apologize. It took me a while to get to the direct question. Well, the opposition is pretty desperate. Many in Navalny's team have moved out of Russia, making difficult decisions about whether to do what he has done and stay in his country. There is, I know there are deep divides about what the right thing to do was. The other thing I think his death showed, and these elections actually even too, is that, as Kim mentioned, there are people who oppose Putin. Tens of thousands stood in line. They weren't permitted to go to his funeral, and you'll recall that the government didn't want to release his body to his mother, that is Navalny's, for a number of days. But people stood up to even just stood in line to put flowers on his grave and continued to do that for a number of days afterwards. One thing I think to note about the elections and the possibility for an opposition forming is that getting this, I think the final result for Putin was 10% higher than in 2018. It was 87.3% with a purported 70, I'm just looking at my notes here, 77.2% turnout. So let's say for a moment that's true and there was no fraud. That means 100 minus 77 is what, 23, right? My math, sorry, it's earlier here in the West Coast. Plus the about 11% that voted for these other approved parties means that like 35% of voters, even with this incredible effort to mobilize, and Putin dominated the airwaves, there's no public debate. It means like 35% of eligible voters still didn't vote for Putin. They either voted for someone else or they didn't vote at all. And in these circumstances, that's a little bit surprising. So there seems to be a part of the population that is not in favor of Vladimir Putin continuing, but it's very dangerous to openly oppose Putin right now. It's not that there's no opposition; it is just difficult to protest openly, and that's why this against Putin at noon movement that Navalny's widow endorsed on Sunday the 17th was quite powerful and interesting, because people stood in line at polls at noon on Sunday, and they could vote or they could spoil their ballots, but at least they saw one another, and I think that was the important thing, to remind them that they're not alone, and it was technically legal.
Thank you. I do have some follow-up questions that I hope I can get to later on, but I want to keep moving because I think you both brought up some interesting points about the opposition. But Kim, I would like to turn to you and talk a little bit about Prigozhin and his mutiny and ultimate demise. That obviously was a topic of conversation a few months ago, or I forget exactly when that happened. How did his mutiny and death impact Putin's position, and has he recovered, or has Putin recovered the regime's stability, and what impact did the mutiny have on Putin's power overall?
Sure. So we'll recall that the mutiny happened in June of 2023. What happened, we think, from putting all of the evidence together, is that Prigozhin had no intention of overthrowing the government. What he saw himself doing was making a march that the Tsar, Putin, would notice and respond to. What Prigozhin was trying to do is get more support, more weaponry, more honor, more money for his Wagner Group forces, and then also, most importantly, to change the leadership of the Russian armed forces, believing that they had sent Putin in a bad direction by what was going on in Ukraine and that it was poorly managed. What Prigozhin did was to make basically two mistakes. The first was he was under Putin's protection and his head got too big for his roof, right? So he was being supported by the Kremlin for what he was doing. He was given a lot of leeway, and he seemed to believe that he had more power and more authority and more leeway than he actually did. And so that was one of the reasons why Putin had to react. And the second thing, of course, that happened during the mutiny is that some of his forces, and probably not under his command, but some of his forces shot down Russian military airplanes and helicopters that were flying overhead of the protests and killed some Russian servicemen. And so this could not have gone by without Putin responding for both of these reasons, both to keep the support of the military and also to ensure that somebody's head didn't get too big for their roof and that they understood who was actually boss. One thing that complicates this, though, is that we also know that there were about a dozen Russian military high-ranking officers who were apparently supportive of the mutiny. And after the mutiny happened, there appears to have been some purge. Those people disappeared. A couple of the very prominent ones were fired. And so that's an indication that the instability went beyond just what the Wagner Group was trying to do, because they were supported by people who were within the realm of power. So immediately after it happened, Putin looked weak because it seemed like he didn't know how to respond, like this took him by surprise. And for 2 months, he didn't do anything. And it even appeared that Prigozhin was continuing to be able to talk about sending his troops to Africa, had gotten millions of dollars returned after the FSB had seized it, and that, Prigozhin was going to be just fine. But I think when the airplane, whatever happened, the blowing up of the airplane occurred in August, that sent a very strong message that Putin was actually in control and that sooner or later Putin was going to get you. And, I get asked the question all the time, did Prigozhin really die, or was this just a setup? And is Prigozhin living on a desert island somewhere? And the answer to that is that it doesn't really matter, because when the explosion happened, whoever was killed in it, whether anybody was killed in it, Prigozhin ceased to have any political influence. And now what we see happening with the Wagner Group is that the forces who had been engaged in the mutiny, who were primarily the ones who had been fighting for Wagner in Ukraine, in Bakhmut primarily, and then had gone back to Russia after their mobilization period had ended. Those people were primarily Russian prisoners that Prigozhin had gotten out of prison in return for their willingness to serve for Wagner, and that meant that they were intensely loyal to Prigozhin. And at first they were sent to Belarus, but then very importantly, we now know that the remnants of them were put under the control of Rosgvardia, the Russian National Guard. And the reason that that matters is that that is under Putin's direct command. It's not under the military. It's not under anybody else. And the person who is the director of Rosgvardia, the person who actually commands and controls their everyday activities, is a man named Zolotov, who has been Putin's bodyguard and close friend since Putin served in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg in the early 1990s, and who was implicated with Putin in some organized criminal activities that happened in St. Petersburg at that time that were then suddenly hushed up. And so Zolotov has every reason to be intensely loyal to Putin. And so the immediate problem seems to be taken care of. And the one question that I would have going forward is, if there is leadership instability at some point in Russia, if Putin dies in office, or if there is some attempt to go against him, what happens to Rosgvardia? And what happens to all of these men who now have heavy weapons at their disposal, who have actually engaged in combat, when the person that they're supposed to be individually loyal to is off the scene or is being challenged? And so that's what I'd be most worried about going forward.
Okay, so something to think about and keep in mind. Staying on the Ukraine piece, I wanted to turn to you, Katherine. Kim had mentioned earlier about the anti-war vote. I'd love to just get your take on why. I mean, it could be a whole lecture on why Putin invaded Ukraine, but I think more importantly, I'd be curious to know, how has Russia's performance during this special military operation impacted his status, and whether losing in Ukraine is an existential threat to his regime, and how these opposition votes play into that picture?
So I think some of the votes that were not explicitly for Putin, Ken said, as opposed to the percentage that is officially against, which seemed to be only about 11% of the 77% that turned out. So some of that is definitely against the war, or in favor of a settlement in the war. And that was certainly part of the number of signatures that were collected for Nadezhd is ending the war. I think there probably is a larger percentage of the population that is against continuing the war. We certainly see in polls, to the extent that you can trust polling, because it's kind of a why would you overtly state opposition to a regime that has become increasingly brutal, especially in the last 2 years? If you can get around it, the easiest thing for most citizens to do would be to say, yes, I completely support everything the president is doing in the war. And so I think we do see a few signs, though, of people being exhausted by this in Russia, especially in this organization. It's relatively small, but they do and have been permitted so far to have some protests at monuments, and even in downtown Moscow, called the Road Home or the Path Home, which is wives of and family members, mostly women, of mobilized soldiers who have been on the front line for 1 year, 2 years, and their families feel they've done their duty, and they'd now like them to be able to be relieved. So, as Kim mentioned earlier, there's a bit of an issue here in that some of them were sent in the autumn of 2022 in what's called a mobilization of reserves. Russia mostly professionalized its army, so it is not a primarily conscript-based army anymore. However, there is a percentage, and Kim will know more about this than me, because this is one of the many things she writes on. There is a percentage, maybe 10, it's supposed to be 10% or so, that are now officially conscripts. But there is this also reserve force, and then, well, people got a little dizzy with success, and as Lenin used to say, with trying to turn out troops in this mobilization in the fall of 2022, and a number of people who maybe shouldn't have been on the front line suddenly were on the front line, and the Russian way of war has turned out to be what it was in the past, even despite the military reform that they've gone through, which is to throw bodies when you run out of ammunition. And so they have a very high casualty rate. Our official CIA figures that came out last fall were, and I think the British Defense Ministry has also issued figures of 315,000 casualties in the first 20 months or so. Kim can correct me if that's wrong. And by casualties, that's either deaths or being so badly injured that you can't return to the battle. So that, if accurate or in the ballpark, would be more casualties than in any conflict, including Afghanistan, right, Kim? That the Soviet Union or Russia has been involved in since the Second World War. That's huge. So I think we're seeing some, in polls, more people saying that even if they're technically saying they're for the war, they're also in favor of negotiating a settlement. The question is, what are the terms? So there's it, and that changes and varies by age as well.
Great, thank you. Kim, I'd like to turn back to you. You mentioned Rosgvardia. I'd be curious to know a little bit more about the world of Putin's intelligence and security services. I mean, obviously, with Wagner.
We're all curious.
Yes, we are all curious.
And apparently they know us, Kim.
But yeah, if you could just walk us through what you know of what the intelligence and security services are to Putin. I mean, obviously, Wagner was a very important part of his foreign policy, and now that has a different I guess, iteration. So I'd be curious just to hear a little bit more about those sectors in terms of his power.
Sure. Well, it's a very complex question. And so let me just start off by saying that there are three major intelligence agencies. There are some others that have been absorbed along the way. One is the FSB, which took over the domestic roles of the KGB when the Soviet Union fell apart, and also has always had responsibility for intelligence gathering in the former Soviet states, because after all, those aren't foreign, they're actually domestic. Second is the SVR, which has the goal of collecting intelligence in the far abroad and messing things up a little bit along the way in places like the United States and Europe. But there's always been some overlap between what the SVR and FSB roles are in those other long distant countries. And then there's the GRU, which is Russian military intelligence, which has a different role than American military intelligence does, because it's not just gathering information on the battlefield. It's also responsible for a lot of special operations like assassinations that happen in foreign countries. And it has responsibility for putting sleeper agents behind the lines and getting ready to mess up things in the deep back of the enemy if a war were about to happen. And there has always been overlap between the jobs of each of those forces, and many people have believed that Putin has enhanced the competitiveness between them to try to keep them divided and therefore not able to wage a conflict against him. Of course, he himself comes out of the KGB and then after that out of the FSB. And so he has, but part of the role that he had in the KGB would have been taken over by what's now the SVR. Complicated relationship, multiple agencies, overlapping goals. What has become clear with time, and this has been happening more and more recently since the invasion of Ukraine, they are cooperating with each other in a way that they didn't used to do. And so it seems like the cohesion among them is actually growing. And one of the reasons that they are so significant for the conflict in Ukraine is that it's very clear that they gave Putin bad information about what he would find on the ground in Ukraine. They took existing public opinion polls that showed that in 2021, President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, was beginning to lose popular support because he wasn't doing enough to clean up corruption, and he was going to face battles going forward, and there was conflict within Ukraine about whether or not there should be some kind of an attempt to make a settlement with Russia after what was going on in eastern Ukraine and Crimea and so forth. That Zelensky wasn't doing well, and the intelligence agencies took that information and switched it to being that Ukraine would welcome foreign intervention and that would easily fall if there was an intelligence operation to assassinate Zelensky and put somebody else in his place. So we know that at least that is part of what happened in terms of why Putin invaded Ukraine. He got bad information. So, I think that the ultimate implications of that are a little bit unclear. We might have expected that there would be a huge purge of the intelligence forces as a result of that. I don't think we have evidence that that huge purge occurred. But then the Wagner Group is very much associated, has been very much associated with the GRU, with Russian military intelligence. And the information that we have about what used to be the Wagner Group and may still be the Wagner Group, who knows, that's on the ground in Syria and in a variety of African countries, is that they are now much more strongly under GRU control, and that the man in the GRU, who had been responsible for planning all the special operations, including the assassinations, has gone to these various countries in Syria and in places like, Libya and the Central African Republic and so forth and so on, Mali, and said, I'm in charge here, and we're going to put a couple of GRU agents on the ground in each of these countries and watch what these folks are doing to make sure that they don't get out of hand. And, if you are a member, knowing what happened to the Wagner Group, knowing what happened to Prigozhin, and now you've got the GRU guy who was responsible for assassinations with a couple of people watching what you do, that's probably going to keep them in line. That's my guess.
Good point. I'll get in one final question before I turn to the Q&A box, because I see that there are some questions in there. And so if you're listening and you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box and I will try to get to as many as we can. Katherine, Kim just walked us through the security services a little bit. I would love to hear your take on Putin and his policymaking in terms of who's setting the agenda in both domestic and foreign policies. What is your take on what that inner circle or that decision-making apparatus is like these days?
So this is the $100 billion question. But so we have some sense, and we've had a few people who've actually left Russia, who used to be very high in the Russian government. So we have some sort of sense of how decisions are made, and even how the decision to go into Ukraine was made. And Kim mentioned that there was obviously an intelligence failure. You might remember we had a similar intelligence failure going into Iraq, where we thought Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney thought that we would be welcomed in Iraq with rose petals, right? And so this is kind of a Russian confirmation bias as well, that they assumed because Zelensky, as Kim said, had a 29% job approval rating before the invasion, that meant that the Ukrainians wanted to be freed by their Russian neighbors, and it turned out they didn't. And so rather than bouquets of flowers hitting tanks, it was homemade Molotov cocktails. So I think that's also a problem with authoritarianism. But confirmation bias happened with us as well. Whether there was no WMD, it turned out, in Iraq. And so that, I think that authoritarian systems like Putin's has a greater tendency to fall to make decisions based on confirmation bias. So in terms of who's making decisions, and in general, and then more specifically about the war, well, so I think it's fair to say that Putin cares about certain things and not as much about other things. And in the certain things that he cares a great deal about, and one is this campaign in Ukraine, which you can only call a special military operation in Russia. You can get into a lot of trouble, even in jail, if you call it a war. He slipped up and called it a war, so he's allowed to call it that, but apparently nobody else is. I facetiously in a piece referred to his election as his special electoral operation, but I see that other people did that as well. So, he's very hands-on, and he is a guy who likes to quote facts as he knows them. Now, the facts may actually not be accurate, but he really likes to talk about facts. And this, you can see this if you look at video from him in 2000, when he was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, an appointed position in the 90s. I said 2000, but in the early 90s. And then you can see it now. He really likes that. So someone feeds him information. He cares a lot about the war. He cares a great deal about the economy and keeping the economy going. And right now he cares about a macroeconomic policy in a way that he didn't used to care about macroeconomic policy, as long as as things were stable and the economy was growing. They have an excellent, technically excellent head of the central bank. It's a woman, one of the few women who's very high up and has such an important job in the Russian government. There are rumors that she had wanted to leave after the war began, and that essentially he wouldn't let her. She is now doing the opposite of what she did to stabilize the Russian economy in terms of macroeconomic policy, not issuing credits. They had budget surpluses before COVID, and then obviously trouble after during COVID, but then they were recovering and their economy was beginning to grow again. Now, because they're under the heaviest sanctions regime in history, especially on an economy that size, and they're both targeted sanctions against specific individuals, companies, and then entire sectors of the economy. There are exceptions. That's part of our, if you want to get into, we could get very deeply into this, but some of it's pretty technical stuff, but they have found ways to adjust, and he has put a great deal of pressure on financial decision makers, especially the central bank, to find ways to fund, in particular, their military industrial complex. And I know that people are making money from it. So one of the sort of negative externalities, as an economist would say, of our sanctions regime and our targeted sanctions against some of the very wealthy men that we refer to as oligarchs, is that they now don't invest outside of Russia as they used to because those assets are frozen. So they invest inside of Russia, and now they're making money because in order to make a shell for artillery, you need metal. Well, metal prices are now going through the roof, and so they're getting contracts because of their now essentially forced loyalty to Putin. So suddenly you've got these guys who may have been very ambivalent to negative about the war quietly making a great deal of money from the war, which kind of keeps it going. They have an interest in that. In terms of who is making decisions around him, well, we think that the head of the Security Council, Patrushev, is kind of with him, a fellow traveler. The former president of Russia, who some of you in the audience may or may not remember, Dmitry Medvedev. Technically, he's the deputy secretary of the Security Council. He's basically just kind of a cheerleader now on Telegram. His Telegram channel. It's almost as though it's a different person, but presumably he's in survival mode and fear mode. In terms of other parts of the economy, well, if you listen to or read Putin's State of the Nation speech, which he gave a few days before Biden's, he started with the war in Ukraine and the importance of winning it, and then the rest of it was really on domestic social policy in particular, and so he's clearly making a decision. Again, they're all in on the war, so everything is about the war. Yes, it's existential for his regime. He's made it that way. And this is why, getting back to the elections, it was so important to have an emphatic exclamation point of support for him and his policies, especially this policy, which was front and center through his quote unquote campaign, which, he just dominates the media anyway, which is all now state controlled. And having a high turnout, really, really important. Even having turnout in these occupied regions of Ukraine, some of which they don't even fully occupy, to show that, look, these are now Russian citizens. They're now voting for me as well. And in return, promising, lower mortgages, payments to people who fight in the war, and especially trying to encourage and heal the demographic problem that they had before and that the war is now making worse by supporting women to have more children.
Thank you. We have some good questions coming in the Q&A box, so I'm going to try to get to as many of them as I can. Kim, I'll start with you. We have one here, and the questioner writes, eventually the Ukraine war will end on the negotiation table. With the collective West challenging the legitimacy of Russia's elections and not even recognizing Putin's elections, will that make negotiations all the more difficult? In other words, will peace be harder to achieve if the West does not recognize the legitimacy of the recent elections in Russia?
So that's a very complex question. I don't think the West has not recognized it. I don't think the West is saying Putin is not the leader that they're going to be dealing with. They have just criticized the election for not being free and fair. But I think the much more important question is, how can we imagine negotiations happening that would end the conflict? And that is such a complex question, but let me just try to address a few points. First of all, I don't think the West wants to negotiate with Russia, because that would be falling into Russia's trap, which says that the Ukraine war is all about a proxy conflict between Russia and the West. And of course, it is not a proxy conflict between Russia and the West. It is a Russian invasion of a weak neighboring country that had no ability to defend itself unless it got Western support for that defense. It is a Russian action. It is not a Western action. And I think it's very important that if we're thinking about negotiations, we think about the fact that it is Ukraine that will be negotiating with Russia. It is not the West that will be negotiating with Russia. The West can support Ukraine, but it has to be Ukraine's decision about what they want to do. Now, that leads to all kinds of other complexities. What would happen to Zelensky? What would happen to any Ukrainian leader if they made the decision to negotiate after so many Ukrainians have been killed, after so much destruction has happened in Ukraine, after Russia has targeted so many pieces of civilian infrastructure, and there have been so many civilian deaths, including the destruction of a major dam that caused just horrendous environmental damage along a major river that goes through Ukraine and that destroyed agricultural territory, after Russia stole so much of the Ukrainian crops and sold it as its own grain on the international market? What would happen to someone in Ukraine who said, we give up and it's time to negotiate? They probably wouldn't last very long in Ukrainian politics. So that's one issue. But then a second issue is, what would Russia be willing to give up? And I think we had a partial answer just a couple days ago when there was a major celebration in Red Square of the 10th anniversary of Russia's seizure of Crimea. And it became very clear that Crimea means an extraordinarily a lot to the Kremlin. And they managed to get many thousands of people out in Red Square screaming on behalf of how wonderful that Crimea was theirs. And so I think going forward, one of the things we have to recognize is that most likely, if we do want a negotiated solution, Russia is not going to be willing to give up Crimea. And my guess is that when push comes to shove, Ukraine could live without having Crimea, because it is just so incredibly important to Russia. And I don't think it has that same kind of visceral, emotional connection for most Ukrainians. Of course, there are people at the top of Zelensky's administration who are from Crimea who think differently. And so it would be a matter of convincing them. But I think that is one thing we should keep in mind. And then the second thing that actually was interesting from this huge rally that happened a couple days ago is that Putin essentially talked about what he had done in eastern Ukraine as being the ability to now build a railroad that would connect the Donbass to Russian, actual Russian territory in Rostov, going down into Crimea through Mariupol, and providing an alternative land bridge to Crimea from Russia that would be in addition to the big Kerch bridge that he already built. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that was sending a signal about what Russia would be willing to give up, is that if Russia were given a land bridge going through that part of the Donbass that connected through Mariupol into Crimea, then maybe that would be a negotiating point. Now, I don't think that is going to be as acceptable to Ukraine, because there were an awful lot of people who were killed in those battles, and a lot of people who were pro-Ukrainian, ethnically Ukrainian, have Ukrainian as their first language, who fought against Russia in those battles, which is also a difference from Crimea. Crimea was taken almost bloodlessly. It wasn't a war that took Crimea. So I think that's the situation that we're in. I don't think Putin can ever be shown to be making any kinds of concessions on this issue. And so if there is going to be a negotiated solution, Putin has to be given something that makes it look as though he's had a victory. But I think that, it's got to be Ukraine that makes this decision, and it's going to be extraordinarily difficult for any Ukrainian political leader to negotiate a solution, given the horrendous losses that Ukraine has suffered because of Russian actions.
Russia seems to be a specialist in frozen conflicts too. So,
well, that also prevents Ukraine from joining NATO. Having a frozen conflict.
Let me just say something about that. You could make the argument that that was part of the reason for Putin getting involved in the Ukrainian conflict anyway, but there is increasing evidence that that's no longer true, and that many leading people in NATO are starting to think about the possibility of rump Ukraine. If not being a member of NATO, at least having some sort of a security guarantee relationship with Western countries. And so I think Putin's actions have actually caused an undermining in what was previously the understanding that you had to resolve all your border conflicts before you joined NATO.
Right. And it would be like an East-West Germany sort of situation, right? Eventually hoping for being reunited, but on that model, right? West Germany obviously joined NATO, even though East Germany was partitioned off during the Cold War.
Fascinating. A couple of questions about opposition. Katherine, I'll turn to you. So, with the first one, and then Kim, I'll turn to you with the second. So the first one, Katherine, is whether or not there is any effective opposition in Russia. And I know we talked a little bit about this in the beginning, but what I would like to know is if there's a little bit more detail in terms of, what is the opposition? And presumably it's not an opposition, but a disparate opposition. And so what does that look like? If you could give a little more color to that.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you think of as opposition. So there are parties in the Russian Duma, which is their lower house of parliament, like our Congress here, House of Representatives, that is not part of Putin's preferred party. He was actually moved, he was self-nominated. So outside of the party United Russia, that's actually in Russian electoral law. The president is not supposed to be part of a party. This is bizarre, but it was Yeltsin's idea in the 1990s, but that is his preferred party, United Russia. So there are alternatives to United Russia in the Duma. One of them is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which every once in a while makes noises about the elections not being free and fair, and they did that in there's an irony, I realize, in the most recent Duma elections, which was a few years ago. And then there is this LDPR, the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, that is not liberal and not democratic, but it is a political party in Russia. That's the only truthful part of its name. And it is primarily a sort of a Russian nationalist party. So you can, since Russian nationalism has become part of Putin's platform, they perhaps have a more narrow interpretation of Russian nationalism as in Slavic, whereas because Russia has a large Muslim population, specifically in the North Caucasus region, which is kind of volatile at times, has been. They fought 2 wars since the collapse of the Soviet Union there in Chechnya. Putin's form of nationalism is more inclusive of and he makes explicit in most of his speeches about Russia that we are a multi-ethnic state, but a great civilization, great culture as a result of it. So those parties are really within system opposition. They primarily vote with United Russia. They've been pretty much co-opted, and so this is primarily who the 3 candidates were. The third was from a party called New People. So there isn't really a big within system. Outside of the system, therefore, is the real way to be a part of the opposition. And there are some brave people who are still on the ground articulating opposition to Putin. They've spent some time in jail. Roisin is one of them. He had been a mayor of a city in the Urals, but it's very dangerous. And so as I mentioned earlier, there's been a split in the opposition about whether to remain in Russia or be more effective outside of Russia and use YouTube, which is one of the channels that has not yet perhaps been blocked in Russia, to present alternative viewpoints to an audience that would use VPNs to watch or listen or follow. Now, a lot of opposition movements Russian opposition movements, and you might see over my shoulder here is a poster that was given to me. So it's probably overdetermined why I'm banned from getting a visa in Russia. But so this poster says "I'm with you," and it's yes, boy, it is actually with the Russian opposition, and it's from a media organization called Medusa that Kim mentioned earlier. They gave that to me, and they are reason I mention them is they're not just a foreign agent. If you're declared a foreign agent in Russia, you have to put that in all of your media. They are an undesirable organization, which is even worse. And so what that means is not only are they not allowed to operate in Russia in any way, but anyone who reads them in Russia, in their online source, can also be punished. So if it's found on your phone, if it's discovered that you're reading it, you can be, fined, and then it can go up from there. And so being arrested, there are 2 opposition figures who are still big opposition figures who are still in jail. There are many others, of course, too, but the 2 big ones, Kara-Murza is one, and Ilya Yashin is the other. Kara-Murza's wife, I was at a conference with her a while ago, and I asked, we were talking about this, and she said, look, it's very hard. Russian prisons are very hard. What her husband has gone through, and he's been twice poisoned as well. He is in isolation, just as Navalny was kept in isolation. And Ilya Yashin is being treated the same way. They are explicitly in jail because of their online condemnations of the initial invasion or re-invasion in 2022. And that is an example to many, many people. You have to be prepared for that possibility, if you're going to be openly opposing the regime, or simply kicked out of university, losing your job, perhaps losing your housing. There's a notorious case of I can't remember, I think she was maybe 10 or 11 years old, this a girl who was, drawing pictures in her against the war, and her teacher asked her why she was doing that, and she said, well, my father discusses it at home, and he had her taken from him and went on the run and was eventually arrested. So these are warnings to people. So we've also seen people arrested for doing things like there's a woman who was replacing price tags in supermarkets with little messages about what was going on in Ukraine, because it is a world turned upside down to watch the Russian media. Ukrainians are Nazis. This is a war of the West against Russia. So she, was eventually found and has also, been punished and imprisoned. So this is the problem, and the intention is to isolate. But again, going back to our original conversation, and I'll stop there. Even with all of this pressure, that's why I pointed out that having 33-35% not explicitly vote for Putin in this election is not insignificant to me in terms of, as Kim said, elections provide information, and that's some information about people who are staunchly not with him at this moment.
Thank you, Katherine. The other side of that, Kim, I'd like to turn to, because we have a couple questions about this, is the opposition that is outside. I know we talked about Medusa, but we have a few questions here, and people would like to know what implications does the potential for united activism and pushback against Putin by Russian diaspora abroad mean, and sort of what are the I guess the threats that those people living abroad need to take into account in terms of how they might be able to influence the political situation, and how they can know if they can even trust opposition, or whether or not it's part of security services.
So it's a complex question, and let me start by saying that what made Navalny so unique, and that probably made him so incredibly threatening to the regime, is that he had very loyal, very well organized opposition centers set up in a variety of Russian regions. And the reason that that is so significant is because political scientists have demonstrated that when, especially Erica Chenoweth in the work that they have done at Harvard, that when revolutions work, when popular revolutions work, is when there is essentially a shadow government in waiting, where there are people who are trained bureaucrats who are able to take over the roles that were played by regime figures up until the revolution happened. And so if, in fact, and I don't think we know this for sure, but if Navalny's support was so significant that he had people who were actually working within the Russian government in these regions who supported him, then he could have been an incredible threat to the regime, because at the point that there was a significant enough protest movement, there would have been a workable new regime to replace the old regime. So let's just say that to start with. And that means that by definition, a diaspora opposition cannot be as effective, because if they are abroad, then it's very difficult to get that kind of support internally. I think, as Katherine has already mentioned, the opposition abroad is fragmented. There are, several individuals who would like to be the leader of that opposition. I don't think they always get along with each other. I think that sometimes egos get in the way. And so I don't think, again, that there is a clear figure, as Navalny was domestically, who can unite people at an international level. And then, of course, this whole situation was very much complicated by the huge outflow of Russians that you had in two big tranches in 2022. The first was immediately after the war happened, when it was people who were highly educated, who had a lot of commercial skills, who perhaps were intellectuals, who were in protest against the war, who saw that their economic circumstances were going to be worsened by the war, and who immediately fled abroad. And there were probably a couple 100,000 people who fled at that time. And then the second major tranche happened in September of 2022, when Putin declared a partial mobilization that included everybody who was at that point a recent veteran of the Russian military, not even a veteran, but somebody who had been conscripted in the Russian military forces, was now subject to this new conscription to go fight in Ukraine. And at that point, you had an additional probably several 100,000, maybe more people leave, mostly young men and the family members of those young men who would have been subject to mobilization. And the reason that that complicated things is that it's well known that globally, every time there is a mass migration movement, there are always bad actors hidden within it. There are always people who are actually intelligence agents. There are always people who are actually criminal actors. There are always people who actually have political goals that are not in line with what the major group of migrants is questioning. So I think it's a very good question. If you are in that diaspora community, how do you know who to trust? And one thing that my co-authors and I from the Center for a New American Security, CNAS, have postulated in a piece that we put out in January of this year, talking about what might happen to the Wagner Group or something like the Wagner Group after the Prigozhin's demise and the official Wagner Group not being what it used to be, is that there's a lot of incentives for similar actors to set up similar groups in especially Russia's immediate neighborhood where there has not been a Wagner Group presence before. And that one of the things that might happen is that because Western intelligence agencies are watching so closely the named people, the people that they know are in Russian intelligence agencies, it might be very much in the interests of Russia to hire people who are in this diaspora movement now, who may have left not because they're disloyal to Russia, but because they didn't want to be drafted, or who may even have left for economic opportunity, but they still are not anti-Russian, to get the opportunity to work for Russia on contract. And one of the things they might be employed to do would be to watch other emigres and figure out what they're doing. And this would certainly not be unprecedented. We know this happened in Soviet times, that there were always people who were actually intelligence agents, KGB agents mixed into emigre groups who would attend emigre activities. And so I think that's a very good question. And I don't think there's a clear answer to it. But if I were an emigre and if I was an emigre and I decided to stay abroad, that's one thing. But if I were an emigre who either intended to return to Russia or who had family members in Russia, because it's well known that they punish the family members, they punish the parents of people who are draft evaders, for example. If I were in that situation, I might also be very careful about the actions that I took, thinking that either I might be punished if I were ever forced to return home to Russia. Let's say I applied for citizenship abroad and wasn't given it and therefore had to return home, or if I had family members at home who could be punished.
Right. Thank you. In the 2 minutes remaining, I really just wanted to see if we could dig in really quickly because we haven't talked about the U.S. piece here. I'd love to turn to you first, Katherine, and then Kim. What do you think the U.S. policy should be right now? And I realize that that's not a quick answer question, but what is it you would most like to see? And also just given that you're both on this sanctioned list, how can there be some sort of diplomatic breakthrough at a time when things are just so bad?
So actually, it is a relatively short answer. Ukraine has to win in some sense, right? The easiest thing that we could do is to continue with our allies in Europe, and by the way, they've actually spent more than we have at this point in the war, and get the bill through Congress. It is a gift to the Kremlin. It is a gift to Vladimir Putin that Mike Johnson is holding this up. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, this is absurd. It is not in the national interest of the United States, if you are an American, to have Vladimir Putin be confirmed in his impression that he can march into any of his neighbors and take them over, or take over substantial portions of their territory. And we will basically, not be there to stop him. So the problem is, if we don't do anything, or if, as President Trump said, once and perhaps future President Trump I'd let Russia do whatever the hell they want if our NATO allies don't pay into some country club idea of NATO, which is what he has. You don't pay dues into NATO. You commit to pay 2% of your GDP on your own military. So fine, some haven't done that. Fine, some have increased the amount of money that they spend. But they've actually, and that's not a bad thing at all. But to say he would let Russia do whatever the hell they want, well, what they want then is Mr. Putin's been now murmuring about Poland. You know, Poland really started the Second World War, he said recently. And so, you know, the Poles are members of NATO. So Putin has been trying to break up NATO for the last 20 years and the European Union. So if what Mr. Trump is saying is he wouldn't honor the Article 5 commitment of NATO, which is an attack on one is an attack on all, and one of the few times that's actually been invoked is in our favor in Afghanistan when we were attacked in 2001, then that is the end of NATO, and they will continue to march east. So that's the clearest thing we can do is get Ukraine to win, and that might mean not just arming them. They don't want our boots on the ground, and we don't want our boots on the ground, but it's also investing in their own defense industry so that they can deter or prevent Russia from doing this again, even if we come to a settlement.
I just want to make sure Kim can answer if she'd like.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Katherine just said, so I'm not going to repeat it. I am going to say something about the sanctions part. What we've seen the U.S. doing in recent months is a really good thing. They are picking out the individual companies that are violating the sanctions regime, and they are using secondary sanctions against them. So just for example, China as a state has been very careful not to violate the sanctions with companies that rely on Western trade and Western investment, which is a huge part of the Chinese economy. But there are small Chinese companies that have been violating those sanctions, including on important components of armaments, for example. And what we've seen the U.S. doing recently is picking out those individual companies. And that has two big impacts. The first is it sends a very strong message that we're watching you and that if you violate the sanctions, you will be punished. But secondly, it sends a message about just how strong U.S. intelligence agents are, that they can get the kind of information that allows these extraordinarily specific sanctions to happen against small, actually tiny in some cases, foreign companies have secondary sanctions against them. And so I think that is the major direction that sanctions are going to go from this point forward. There's a limit to how much sanctions against Russia itself can accomplish, but now it's a matter of using secondary sanctions against people who are violating Western sanctions towards Russia.
All right. Thank you both. On that note, we are over time. I really appreciate all the insight into this tricky topic. With that, just want to say thank you to Katherine and Kim, and thank you everyone for participating and the great questions. Our next event, we have, I believe, an in-person event coming up in New York on April 4th, and we'll be looking at the Middle East in the wake of what's happening in Gaza. And then we do have our annual gala coming up at the end of April on April 29th. So please do come and join us if you can. It is our biggest fundraiser and it allows us to keep everything free and open to all. So with that, thank you, Kim. Thank you, Katherine. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.